My name is Eric Butters. I'm involved with the Historical Research Committee of the MD of Bighorn, and I'm joined today by Paul Gipson, who is the son of Dalton and Gloria Gipson, and Paul's going to tell us the story of his folks and his family. So welcome, Paul. Thanks for joining us, and just start at the beginning. Where were your mom and dad born and raised, and how did they meet?
Well, thank you, Eric. First of all, I'd like to start by telling you how much I appreciate the work your committee's doing, and in this way, doing it with the videos, because I think it's a great way that I can tell my family's story and not have to, see it in a video presentation rather than have to read a history book. So let's begin with Dalton George Thomas Gipson. He was my dad was born in May 25th, 1925, and he actually had dual citizenship. He was born in Rochester, New York, and his parents, they were in the state of New York. His dad, my grandfather, George Gipson, was a farmer in upstate New York, and that's where Dad was born, in Rochester. He actually made a trip back when he retired and got his birth certificate. He and Mom took off in a motorhome and did a trip around North America, and that was in the 1980s. And he stopped in Rochester, New York. I can still see a mental picture of my dad driving that 30-foot motorhome through New York and down the east coast of the United States. Anyway, he actually got his birth certificate, which I have at home. And so he was born in Rochester, New York, and one of his first jobs was driving. Have you heard of a sulky jockey? Mm-hmm. He drove sulky in a racetrack in upstate New York when he was in his teens, and the two big wheels in the cart behind the horse and the racetrack, and I remember him telling me stories about that, and he enjoyed that when he was young. Then his family, they moved to basically it's just across Lake Ontario, across the St. Lawrence River into Ontario, the Kingston area, and he had a dairy farm. His dad had a dairy farm, and Dad worked on the dairy farm for a number of years. In those days, education wasn't what it is today, and he went as far as grade 8 and then left school and went to work, which wasn't uncommon. Mm-hmm. Most did. So, and then he met Mother, Gloria Elizabeth Armitage. She was an Armitage, and I understand they met at her parents had a summer cabin on Collins Lake, which is just outside of Kingston, Ontario, and they met at a summer camp on Collins Lake, and started in those days they call it a courting. Started sparking, and he and Mom started dating, and they married in July of 1944. And Gananoque, Ontario is where they were married, which is not far from Kingston, Ontario, the Thousand Lakes country, in Thousand Islands country in and around Kingston and the St. Lawrence. It's where it empties out of Lake Ontario into the St. Lawrence River and heads on down to Montreal. So that area in there, the Thousand Lakes area. So 1944, and then a year later, my older sister Donna came along, and she was born in 1945. And then a year later, I came along. I was born in August of 1946, and shortly after my birth, Mom always tells a story about bringing me west in a handbasket. So they got on the train and came west in 1946, and they came all the way to a little community west of Jasper, a place called Eddy, BC, which is very close to McBride, now I guess would be the biggest area. And Mom's brother, Uncle Frank, was working in a sawmill there, and I guess he talked his brother-in-law and his sister into bringing their family out west, and they settled in Eddy, BC, and there was a sawmill there, and Dad was employed in the sawmill during the winter months, and also he talked about working the spare board on the CNR Railway out of Jasper, from Jasper to Prince George. And I can remember Mom telling stories about Dad, especially at Christmas time and so on. The track ran directly west on the route of the Yellowhead Highway today, all the way to Tujon Cache and then west to Prince George, and Dad would drop off bundled up Christmas presents and gifts at Christmas time, throw them off the train to right by our house where we were living there in Eddy, BC. And so he was a brakeman on the CNR Railway, and a sawyer and a tail sawyer on a mill in Eddy, BC. And that was 47, 48, 1948, 49. And then, for a variety of reasons, I'm not sure they're all that important or significant, but they packed everything up and in 1949 and moved to Calgary, down to Calgary, Alberta. And we lived in a house on just off of Kensington Road in downtown, in Calgary. And in those days, I guess Calgary was a city of about 100,000 maybe, not much more. And and Dad, that was one of our first trips I can remember back east to Ontario. He went all the way down to Ontario and we went down on the Greyhound bus, Mom and Dad and Donna and I. David, my younger brother, wasn't born he didn't come along until 1954. Anyway, Mom and Dad and Donna and I took a Greyhound bus trip all across Canada back to back to Ontario to visit all the relatives, and Dad bought a 4-ton Ford truck, and from a truck plant in Oshawa, Ontario, and we picked the truck up and drove that truck all the way back from Ontario.
Those were single cab trucks in those days.
Yeah, the big bench seat. I can still remember, I wasn't very old, and I can remember that trip. And he brought that gravel truck all the way back out to Calgary, and he drove gravel truck for Standard Gravel in Calgary in the summertime, and in the winter he drove taxi cab for United Cab, and a few other jobs. I remember I sat down one time, Eric, and listed all of the different occupations and vocations that my father had been involved in his lifetime, and it numbered close to 20 different occupations, things that he had done to earn some money and put food on the table. Anyway, not to ramble on at too much greater length, and get to the history of the family on Jameson Road. So it was 1949, 1950, and my mother's dad, my grandfather, Fred Armitage, had come out to Calgary, and he was living in Calgary. And he was a promoter, a salesman, a businessman. He'd been in the lumber industry for many years, and he actually worked for the Eddy Match Company in Eastern Canada. And he was out, and he talked Dad. He had this grand design in his mind that he wanted to start a lumber company, which he did, called Cedartex Lumber, and he talked Dad into, and he wanted to locate this lumber company, the mill and the planer shed and everything, in Cochrane. And so he worked with the Cochrane Town Council, And the idea was that he would get logs off the Morley Indian Reserve and log with the Indians and out in this area, up Jameson Road. And he talked Dad into buying, they bought 5 quarters, 800 acres, right across the river from here, right at the end of Jameson Road. CPR land, 800 acres. In those days, I think I can remember Dad saying it was like $10 an acre, so but that was a lot of money in those days, 1950. So we bought 5 quarters of land, and the idea was we'd log it and haul the logs into the mill in Cochrane.
Was there a road?
Well, no. There was it was an old gravel road, and in those days there were only 6. We only had 5 or 6 neighbors up Jameson Road. Started with Sandy Jameson, and then the next neighbors were Eddie and Elma McCoy and the Bruceys, and then old Mac McDonald had a place there. Oh, Bill and Mariette Richards, Doug's uncle, and then Bud Jewell, and then Larry Williams. And Larry Williams had a sawmill up there right at the end of Jameson Road. And that's where the road ended. And I remember when we came out, we were living in Calgary, and when we came out to the land Dad had purchased on Jameson Road, we would stop at Larry Williams. And Dad had an old cat, a DA cat with a sloop on the back. And we'd load everything on the sloop and go through the quarter. It was an old logging road, basically, no gravel or anything, and we go all the way down to the house. The old cabin there was an old cabin there on the property that Mom and Dad eventually built their first house right next to, and that's how we would get there. And so I remember when we did move out there, the first job Dad took on was logging the road allowance from Larry Williams. It was a mile, 2 quarters, half a mile, down to our gate, and he logged that whole road allowance, took the logs into Cochrane to the mill, and then had that old DA cat, and he pushed a road in there. It was certainly not to MD standards. It is today, but it was a road and gave us straight access down to the ranch. Registered a brand, 4D Half Diamond was the Dalton. I'm actually Dalton Jr., but I've always gone by Paul. But Dalton, David, and Donna. So it's
4Ds.
4D Half Diamond, yeah. So now getting back to Cedartex, so Grandpa Armitage. So he worked out a deal with the Cochrane Town Council, he said not a lot of pictures, but I did bring pictures of the actual, the day they had the sod turning in those days, at the base of Cochrane Hill, right across the railway tracks. Graham Broach was the mayor, R.E. Moore was on town council, Mum's in the picture, and Grandpa Armitage. Dad, I think, took the picture, and that's an actual picture of the sod turning on the day they're going to build the Cedartex mill at the bottom of Cochrane Hill on the other side of the tracks. Right over on the land where now is Spray Lake Sawmills are there now. There's an actual picture of the mill, and actually some logs from up Jameson Road, I'm sure, at the Cedartex mill.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
Well, it's great to have those photos.
Yeah, and so that would have been 1950. So Mom and Dad we were still living in Calgary, but they had the land up here, up Jameson Road, and Grandpa Armitage had worked out his deal with the town of Cochrane, and they got the mill built. And then things fell apart. My Grandpa Armitage, I love him dearly. He was a great gentleman, but he was much better at promotion and salesmanship than he was at running a business. And I think Cedartex and the mill lasted about 3 or 4 years, and went into receivership. And they got into all kinds of financial difficulty with investors and whatever. I was just a young kid in elementary school, so the details I don't remember. I may have known them, but I don't remember them all, recall them all that well. Anyway, Cedartex went belly up, went into receivership, and Grandpa Armitage retired.